Good day. My name is Gene Rice. I'm an associate professor of philosophy at Fort Hays State University, and the title of this lecture video is Social Contractarianism. The goal for today is to give you an introduction to social contract theory. It is an important and long-standing tradition in political philosophy, and we're going to begin, as we have in most of these videos on the theories, with a little bit of background. And so actually we'll have 4 or 5 slides at least of review, and then 4 or 5 slides moving on to cover the topic for the day in more detail. This is not an exhaustive lecture. This is meant to supplement the work that you're doing in class. And of course you probably should have already read the chapter in your text or the readings on social contract theory. So this will be another voice, another chance for you to learn a little bit of social contract theory. Most of it will be things which you'll run into again in other areas. So let's begin with a little bit of review on ethics. Remember, ethics is the science of human conduct and can be divided into various subdivisions. The first and most important of which is to distinguish between philosophical ethics and descriptive ethics. Descriptive ethics is concerned with the sciences of describing what people believe, how they act in moral situations, what they believe is right or wrong. So the anthropologist spends time, all of their time, perhaps describing what particular cultures believe about particular moral situations. So for example, they might say that in culture A, marriage practice involves polygamy, right? Many wives for one man. In another culture, they might describe the marriage practices as being monogamous. But as an anthropologist, if they are describing the culture, that is their primary job. They are not attempting to change the culture or judge the culture, evaluate it. That judging, that evaluation, is what is called philosophical ethics. And so if you look then again at the chart, the philosophical study of human conduct is the study of human conduct with an eye towards evaluating the conduct, saying whether or not we should allow polygamy in society, whether that's moral to have many partners, many wives for one husband, or many husbands for one wife, which is polyandry. And under the philosophical study of ethics, we have lots of different branches, one of which, of course, then is ethical theory, and under that, political philosophy. So what we're going to look at today is social contract theory, which is a theory of morality most often found, in the study of political or social philosophy. And so let's move on to look a little more at social contract theory. Again, this is probably review, but we'll spend a little bit of time reminding you about the elements of moral decision-making. Any single moral situation can be looked at from a variety of perspectives. The way I have tended to break these down for you is to break them down based on whether you're looking at the agent who is doing the action or considering the moral situation, whether you're looking at the action itself, the kind of action it is, or whether you're looking again at the consequences of the action. And so I've given you a little chart with some symbols on it to help you visually remember these 3 elements. It's not always clear, of course, who's doing the deciding which of the elements they're looking at, but hopefully this will give us a start towards separating out the various possible perspectives that we might use to look at a particular situation. Each of those 3 symbols then can be associated with various moral theories. Agent-centered moral theories are theories which focus on the virtue or character of the individuals involved. You may have heard the phrase, what would Jesus do, or what would Buddha do, or what would my Uncle Frank do? And these are ways of asking yourself what a virtuous agent would do. Right? And if you ask yourself, I'm not sure whether I should support the war on terrorism, or whether I should endorse a particular individual to be President of the United States, you might ask yourself, well, what would a moral exemplar, a moral paradigm, or what would a moral person do? Got my question mark in the wrong spot. Right? And this person might be Jesus, or it might be your mom, or it might be Buddha. Right? This is a way of focusing your moral analysis on the agent. All right? Another perspective is to focus on the act itself. And as we'll see today, the social contract movement in political philosophy attempts to analyze the action itself. It's not necessarily looking at virtues or at particular figures. It's saying, does this act pass a certain kind of a test? Another theory which you may or may not have considered already is the natural law perspective. That is an act-based theory as well. The final element here is to look at the consequences. Right? And so some moral theories like utilitarianism say, we don't have to look at the person, we don't have to look at the nature of the act, we just look at the consequences. If they're for the greatest good, says utilitarianism, then we are to do the act. If we're an egoist, we always do what's good for us, for our ego, right? So we look at the consequences which maximize my personal happiness. Okay, so those are consequentialistic moral theories on that side, and over here we have non-consequentialistic theories, including those that focus on the agent and those that focus on the act. And today then we're going to be concerned with social contract theory as our primary focus. All right, so I will, having done that on the board, I'll scroll through that next two sets of slides there. This should again be review for you, I hope, and we've covered that. So let's go to the slide now called Social Contractarianism Main Principles. All right. As you may have already guessed, social contractarianism comes from the idea of a contract. Most of us have some idea of what a contract is. It comes, of course, from law or from legal contracts between people, generally adults, or between adults and corporations and so forth, or legal counsel. And the idea here, the most important idea of a contract, is the principle of consent. And the idea of consent is simply that we agree willingly to enter into the contract. So one good example might be of a marriage, right? So if I am going to be married in many cultures, although not all cultures, you have to consent to the marriage. That is, you have to agree willingly to enter into contract to marry this person, right? Or we may take an example from business. Suppose that I go and I want to to take out a savings account at a bank. And so I agree to sign some papers, and I give them my money, and they get to use my money for certain purposes. But when they agree to pay me a certain percentage as an interest rate and so forth. So taking out a loan or getting a savings account started is also an example of a contract. And social contract theory says that we can look to this idea of consent as the foundation for our morality, a foundation for our political system, right? That one of the most important bases for government then will be the idea of the consent. Of course, when we're talking about political foundation, it's consent of the governed, that is the people, consent of the people, right? The ordinary people who the government has power over. And so this is the first main principle of contractarianism. The second and equally important principle of social contractarianism is what we might call mutual benefit. The principle of mutual benefit says that morality is about contracts or consenting individuals who are interested in their own benefit. Right? And that the idea of consent comes with this idea of benefit. So when I get married, let's go back to the marriage example. When I decide to get married, I'm getting some benefit from it, right? I'm getting all kinds of benefits from it. I might feel good inside. Maybe she comes with a large herd of cows as a dowry. Maybe I'll have some children and so forth. And so we could list lots of benefits of marriage. And that's part of what it is then to engage in the consensual contract to begin with, right? The same goes for the example of taking out a loan at a bank or starting up a savings account, right? I get benefits from the contract. And so in social contract theory, there's this idea that morality is not so much about making the king happy or pleasing rich people or powerful people, or it's not so much about maybe even God or about getting to heaven or something. Morality is about benefiting me and other people like me. And so the social contract theory says that that is one of the foundations of government, right? One of the foundations of the theory is that the people should get some benefit from their government. And that a government, as we'll see later, you probably already anticipated this, if the government is not benefiting the people, is hurting some of the people, or maybe even killing some of the people, then the government is no good. Right? It's not going to pass the test of consent. We're not going to derive any benefit from it. And the third principle there is what we might call original equality. And we're going to come back to this here in the next slide. But the idea of equality here is important. That in some sense, human beings are naturally equal, or that we are all equally able to be governed and to have a say in the government. There's going to be different ways of interpreting that, and we'll see here in a second. The final note I have there is just to remind you again that this is an act-based approach. Can the action, if it's an individual moral dilemma, or if it's a political law or a political institution, would the law under consideration be consented to willingly by all parties? Will they have some benefit out of it? if they can consent, then the action will be considered moral or just. And so social contract theory says that when we're looking at institutions, or when we're looking at particular laws, legal statutes, or whether we're deciding personally what we should do in a moral situation, we have to see whether or not the people who are affected could consent to the action. So, for example, I could never kill another person and have it be just in almost all cases, because the other person could never willingly consent to such a thing, right? When we look at institutions or in political systems, we have to ask ourselves, according to social contract theory, whether the people could consent, whether they will have some kind of a benefit from it. Okay. So those are some of the main principles of social contract theory, and remember that it's an act-based system. It's looking at evaluating particular actions or particular laws, which of course would guide actions, and asking, can they pass the theory by focusing on whether they can, whether we could consent to them, those people who are affected by them. And so let's look then now at what the third principle might mean. As almost all moral theories develop, we see differing interpretations of some of their most important points. And it's certainly true of social contract theory that different philosophers and politicians understand the principles in different ways. If we look then at the one of the historical founders of social contract theory, Thomas Hobbes, we'll see that his idea of equality is an idea of natural powers, that human beings were basically equal in what we could do physically. And so I was, roughly as fast as most other human beings. Now, granted, I might be a little slower than Frank or John or Mary, but I was probably about as fast as Frank and John and Mary when I compared the 3 or 4 of us to a cat or a slug or a cheetah. That is, we would all be faster. Most humans are almost all faster than slugs and slower than cheetahs. And so when Hobbes said that humans were all equal in what he called the state of nature, he meant that we all had about the same powers. We were all about the same strength and the same speed, and we had about the same intellectual powers. And for Hobbes, this wasn't really a good thing, because it meant, in the end, that anybody could get away with almost anything, including murder. And so, although I might be a little stronger than Frank, Frank might be a little smarter than I was. And although Mary might be a little stronger than me or faster than me, I could think of a way to kill her or to capture her. And so under Hobbes' theory, when he talked about equality, what he meant was we were all basically liable to be killed by others. And so Hobbes thought the state of nature, the state of not having a government over us, was a terrible thing. Nasty, brutish, and short. And so Hobbes thought it was for our mutual benefit to have a very strong, centralized government that had almost absolute power. And he likened this government to a fiery dragon from the deep, which he called the Leviathan, which is a biblical figure. And so you may or may not read some more about Hobbes' theory of government. It's a very important one. But we're not going to focus on his theory today. We're going to focus on someone else's, John Rawls. But before we get there, let's look at John Locke. John Locke is, again, another famous English philosopher who thought that, well, social contract theory was basically right, but when he was thinking about equality, he did not think about it as an equality of natural powers, but rather an equality of what he called natural human rights. And Locke thought that these human rights came to us because we were all children of God. Locke's culture was, or his society, England, was of course run by Christian church, and most of the people in the system were Christians, and so it made sense for him to think about equality in a moral sense, not in a natural or in a sense of natural liability, but rather in a sense that we all had a right not to be killed. We had all had a right to be free. Of course, for Locke, he mostly meant white males, but we were all children of God, roughly, and so we could consent to a limited form of government, right? And he thought it would be good to have government because it would be a little more efficient, and it would be good because it's hard to punish people when there is no government, hard to punish people fairly. Even if we had the right to punish people who hurt us, we would tend to do a bad job of it. And so Locke thought that we had a benefit or a reason, an individual reason, to consent to a limited government. Not the strong, absolute kind of centralized power that Hobbes had in mind, but a more limited government. And Locke's famous provision is that if the government is violating any of our God-given rights, that we could overthrow it. Because the point of government was to protect those rights and to make things more efficient and so forth. And if they violated the human rights, we could overthrow that government. Now, in the West, we sometimes tend to take this for granted, that the government has to answer to the people, and that if it gets too powerful and is not benefiting the people, that it ought to be overthrown. And of course, the West has a history of revolutions, some of them good, some of them bad, most of them bloody, having to do with overthrowing people who are governing others without their benefit or consent. Okay, the third interpretation of original equality is John Rawls's, and that'll be the focus for the rest of this video lecture today. Rawls's idea of equality is what we might call moral equality behind a veil of ignorance. He is not going to appeal directly to God-given human rights. What he'll say is that when we think about contracting a government or contracting a moral system, we should put ourselves behind what he calls a veil of ignorance, a position where we do not know some of the things which would tend to make us biased in our own favor. And behind this veil of ignorance, in what he calls the original position, we can test laws and actions and so forth to see whether everyone could consent to them. So that was a mouthful there, and we're going to spend some time pulling apart this idea and testing it out. So let's go to Rawls's version of social contractarianism. John Rawls was an American philosopher. He died in 2002 there. Very, very famous, probably rightly known as the person who revived political philosophy in the United States and in the Western world. And we're going to look at three important elements of his social contract theory. So if we remember that there are three principles to social contract theory: the principle of consent, the principle of mutual benefit, and the principle, let's see, of original equality. So we have consent, some idea of equality, and some idea of mutual benefit. And we're going to then flesh these out for John Rawls. The first thing we should notice is that for Rawls, consent is a hypothetical test or a hypothetical experiment, a procedure for testing moral situations. This is very important. It is not a fact. John Rawls did not believe that somewhere we all consented to be under the sway of the American government, or anyone who's living in a democracy does not consent actually. There is no, there's not a document anywhere that says I consented to be in the United States. Now, in legal settings, in actual legal situations, of course, there would be an actual document with my signature on it which says I consent to this, right? So let's go back to the marriage example. I'm married somewhere, I don't really know where, in some building somewhere, there is a piece of paper which has my name on it, and it has my signature and my wife's signature, and it says I consent to this marriage. And somewhere down at my bank, there's a piece of paper which I signed, which says I'm going to give you my money, and you could do things with it, but I could take it out, and you have to give me this much interest, right? But Rawls says you don't. So the social contract is not an actual contract; it's a hypothetical contract, and it's a way of testing laws and moral situations. So this is what he calls a hypothetical test, and it's in what he calls the original position. This is the bargaining test of moral and political actions. And Rawls says we have to imagine, hypothetically, if everyone could consent to a particular situation. And if they cannot consent to it, then it is immoral. And if everyone can consent to it, then it's moral. So again, let's go back to the situation where we're talking about murder. Suppose I had planned in a moral situation to kill somebody. Well, of course that person cannot consent to the killing, and so I don't even need a signature or to consult another person to ask whether or not murder is moral or immoral. It's almost always immoral because the person who's getting killed cannot consent to it. Okay? So, Rawls adds an important element to this analysis, which is what he calls the veil of ignorance. The veil of ignorance says, I'm going to ignore my own subjective preferences and things like my race, my religion, if I have one, and my economic status. So the important word there is to ignore it, right? The idea of a veil is of a covering which partially obscures, right? It's not a hood. A hood would make you totally ignorant. The veil of ignorance makes you kind of ignorant. What are you ignorant of? What don't you know? Well, you're supposed to ignore or be ignorant of your race. So I would be, if I were behind the veil of ignorance, I would try to forget about the fact that I'm a white Caucasian and that I'm male and that I have a certain socioeconomic status and so forth. And why does he do this? Right? Well, behind the veil of ignorance, you get rid of things which tend to mess up or skew your moral decision making. And so this part of the test is going to help ensure that we come to a just resolution. And incidentally here, it's probably, I should have already mentioned this, Rawls's theory he calls justice as fairness, right? And this is where the fairness comes in. Right? If I'm deciding whether or not to take out a loan and everyone can consent to it, and I put myself behind the veil of ignorance and no one would be harmed unduly by it, then it's fair and it passes the consent test. It's a hypothetical test. Okay. Rawls also says that that we're generally self-interested people, and that morality is about making sure we benefit everyone, right? Or that everyone can consent to the kinds of benefits that we're talking about. And equality also comes in here with the veil of ignorance. Okay? So Rawls builds in the idea of equality. Right? So he's already said, well, we didn't put gender down here, but he's already assumed that men and women are equal and that we're to forget about our gender, right? And he's already assumed that black people and white people and yellow people are all the same. So we're supposed to forget about our race. And he's also basically said that all people, whether religious or not, are equal. So he's built in both fairness and equality into the original position. All right? The other element here of Rawls's theory is what you might call pluralism. Rawls believes that there are many acceptable lifestyles or life plans, and that we have to accept that reasonable people can disagree on what the best life is. So some people will include being a part of a religious community as part of their life plan, right? They'll be very involved in Buddhism or Islam, and they'll go to services, and they'll send their kids to religious schools and so forth, and they'll follow additional religious rules. Maybe they'll make the trip to Mecca or something like that. Others will have a life plan that is atheistic, that doesn't have anything to do with God. And still others will have different life plans where they try to get really rich or something like that, and try to accumulate as much material wealth as possible. So Rawls says that all of these plans are basically acceptable, and individuals will be seeking their own mutual benefit from them, right? And so we have to incorporate what he calls a reasonable pluralism in our social contract theory, our consent. So with these principles explained a little bit more, we'll take some examples now, and then we'll get to Rawls's two principles of fairness. So what we're going to do now is take these elements and try to apply them a little bit to give you an example of what it looks like. So let's take an example of a law, let's see, a law requiring religious donations. So money. Suppose some lawmaker, whether you're in a democracy or in some other non-democratic form of government, suppose you're in a theocracy, the government said, well, we're going to make everyone give 10% of all their money to the church of their choice. And so this is the proposal. And Rawls says, okay, if we want to know whether that is just, we have to see whether it's fair. What does fairness mean? Well, For Rawls, it means that the law could pass the test of consent. Now, if we take this example and we put it into the test, so we put it into our hypothetical bargaining procedure, and we say, could I agree to this if I didn't know any of the things that I'm going to be ignorant of behind the veil of ignorance? So, could we agree to this law? And it's probably pretty clear that Rawls would say we cannot agree to force people to give 10% of their money to a religious institution. And why could we not do this? Why could some people, or why could we not consent to this behind the veil of ignorance? Well, because we don't know whether we would be religious or not behind the veil of ignorance. And so Rawls says then that this is the kind of law that could not pass the test of justice as fairness. Now, I hope that makes sense. Let's change it a little bit. Suppose now that the government is trying to pass a law that would require 10% of money for taxes for the government instead of for religion. Right? Now, remember that part of social contract theory is the idea of mutual benefit and the efficiencies we achieve when we have a stable working government. If you're not sure whether those efficiencies are important, go to a country that's falling apart or that's at civil war, and you'll see how hard it is to do business when there's no government or no functioning government. How hard it is to raise your children when there's no functioning government, and so forth. That's just a little aside there. Let's go back to the example. Could a law that requires 10% taxes pass the test of justice as fairness? And again, I think it's pretty clear here that the answer in this case is yes. Because whether I'm religious or not, whether I'm male or female, white or yellow, red or black, whether I'm interested in material goods or not, the answer is it's to my own mutual benefit to have a government that works, and if the government says it needs about 10% of my money in order to do the basic things of government, well then I could consent to that. Now, what if the government wanted to take 90% of my money? Well, then it becomes a little more difficult to say whether or not that's fair, whether or not I could consent to that. So there'll be lots of things that we ordinarily think are quite immoral that clearly are not going to pass the consent test. We cannot consent to murdering people. We cannot consent to having people steal from us. We cannot consent to a government which throws people in jail for no reason. We cannot consent to religious persecution or endorsement of religions in the government and so forth. So there's a range of powerful examples having to do with our ordinary moral judgments which seem to fit with this idea of consent. Okay, so those are some examples. I hope you understand the basic concept of the theory. Let's go now back to the slide and look at what Rawls thinks the theory produces. So, what is justice? Justice is fairness. What is fairness? Fairness is the application of the original position, testing our principles according to the original position. Rawls claims that there will be two general results of the original position. That is, if we think of the relationship of consent to government, and we ask ourselves, what could we consent to as citizens of a particular situation, a particular government? We would have two rules. The first establishes what Rawls calls equal basic rights for everyone. These are not absolute rights. They're as extensive, as broad, as wide as they can be, given the fact that we have to give them to everyone. So when we're talking about equal basic rights, we're talking about the bodily integrity. We have the right not to be murdered, beaten, tortured, extorted, and so forth. And a lot of liberties, right? So we have the freedom of movement, freedom of conscience, freedom of religion, and so forth. And Rawls says that behind the veil of ignorance, we would all consent to equal basic rights, because nobody knows behind the veil of ignorance whether they're going to be white or black, rich or poor, religious or non-religious. And so we would all, for our own benefit, remember, for our own benefit, we would all agree to equal basic rights for everyone. All right? The second principle, which is a little more complicated, a little more difficult, is meant to allow some social and economic distribution, some unequal distribution. So unequal, right? So we start off, the first principle was about equal basic rights, and the second principle says that there can be some unequal economic and social distribution. But it has to pass two principles in order for it to be allowed under Rawls's theory. Let's note something first here, though. What he's saying is his social contract theory is not a pure kind of communism. And I'll put pure here in scare quotes. Communism would say that everyone is to get, pure communism would, in theory anyway, say that everyone is to get an equal economic and social distribution, right? That essentially the pie is to be divided into as many parts as there are people. Rawls says that behind the veil of ignorance, we could not agree to that. That there are some cases where it's okay for some people to make more money or to have more power than other people. And so the second principle of justice guides us in trying to define which distributions are okay. So we need then, if we go back to that slide, I'm not going to write it down up here, it's too long, but there are two criteria that any proposal must pass in order to pass justice as fairness. The first is what we'll call fair and equal opportunity. Jobs, schools, and other positions of power, what we might broadly call opportunities, must be open to everyone, and everyone must have a fair start to achieve them. So, you cannot, for example, pass a law that would prevent women from becoming doctors, or white people from becoming doctors, because behind the veil of ignorance you could never agree to that. Everyone also must not only have an opportunity to achieve the job, but it must be a fair game to start with. In other words, we couldn't say, well, women could become doctors, but we're not going to educate them until they're 35. Right? we could not consent to that because it wouldn't be a fair opportunity. Even if technically women were not prevented from becoming doctors, it would not be fair because the women wouldn't have the education they need to become doctors. Okay, the second principle is called the difference principle, which says that differences in economic and political theory are only allowable if they benefit the least advantaged. So, let's take some examples of this and see if we can make some sense of this. I'm going to erase some of this up here. Let's take the example of, this is one of Rawls's examples, paying doctors lots of money. In a purely communistic model, doctors would get paid essentially the same amount as other people would get paid. Now again, this is, we're not doing a theory on communism here, and not all communist governments or forms of communism agree with that, but the basic idea is a kind of equal distribution. Rawls says that paying doctors a lot of money passes both principles. As long as everyone can become a doctor and we roughly prepare people for the opportunity, that is, we give them a good education, when they're young, and they all get enough food so that they're not starving to death. As long as we do that, it will benefit everyone to pay doctors well. Of course it will benefit doctors because they will get paid more, but it will also benefit even the poorest person. Because if we pay doctors more doctors will go into medicine, and the poorest benefit from better doctors. If we pay doctors the same amount as ditch diggers, or the same amount as janitors or custodians, then less people would go into doctoring, and Rawls says, well, then that would not benefit everyone, because if we had the best and the brightest becoming doctors, then everyone, even people who are not doctors or who are poor, are going to end up benefiting. So, Rawls says that some economic and some social inequality is okay. And it's okay because it benefits everyone. Now, these examples are difficult. One thing that we have to keep in mind, though, is that Rawls says the second principle of justice, differences in inequality, differences in social and economic distributions, can never be justified to override the first principle of justice. So you could never pay doctors so much that you were taking away money from the police force or the military, and so that those institutions were no longer able to provide for the safety of everyone, right? That would not be able to pass the test of consent, the hypothetical test. Because again, behind the veil of ignorance, I don't know whether I'm smart enough to become a doctor. I don't know whether I'm poor. But I do know that if we're paying doctors so much that we can't afford, police officers, that I couldn't consent to that. Right? So we have to have some balance. And so you can never sacrifice a person's basic rights to liberty, to bodily security, and so forth, for unequal social and economic distributions, paying people a lot of money or giving them a lot of power. So those are the two results. Rawls thinks that there are basically two results to his approach, And those are the two results. Equal basic rights for everyone, and what we'll call unequal social and economic distributions are just only under certain circumstances. Okay, you'll probably have a chance to work through some more examples of those on your own and in class. Let's move then to some objections to social contract theory here. The first objection has to do with the idea of consent. We already talked a little bit about this. The question is whether or not consent must be actual consent or whether it can be implied or hypothetical. So I have, for example, never signed a contract which gave the President of the United States power over me. Does that mean that there is no contract? Does it mean that by staying in the United States I've implied that it's okay that the government has power over me? Or can we have some kind of hypothetical test like John Rawls's principle? The second objection has to do with whether we should be pluralists about life goals and values. Some people believe the government has no business telling us how to live our lives. Other people believe that that's the government's primary purpose, is to help us lead better lives, and that we shouldn't just leave people to their own devices. And lastly, there we list, again, another thing you'll talk about as you move along here, is whether Rawls's idea of the original position is already morally loaded. It already has too much moral content. Concepts like equality, fairness, individualism, and self-interest, things which we may not want to include in our political theory. So in other words, does it beg questions that it's supposed to be answering? And so that's another common objection to social contract theory. Social contract theory is one of the most powerful and influential kinds of government, particularly, of course, in the West and in certain parts of the West, like the United States. This is one of, if not the most important, approach to political philosophy. But there are some objections to it. The three that I mentioned there are not, of course, the only objections, but there are three that you'll have reason to consider further as you move forward in considering social contract theory. So I wish you all the best in your consideration of contractarianism, and we'll probably be seeing each other soon again.